we have corporate education. What I saw is that people in general in educational institutions are taught what to think, but they are not taught how to think.
Right.
And my father and the people that I worked for as a young man taught me how to think.
Right.
Because if you don't know how to think, especially where I come from on Vancouver Island, where you can be buried in snow and next minute swimming in rain and mud, and you still got to get the job done. Things have to go on. Life goes on. So it's a much harder environment.
And give me an example of that. Then I think I get what you're saying, but in terms of at school they teach you what to think, and in your farm it's how. So give me an example of what you learned about how to think.
Well, what I learned about how to think is one, you always have to study both sides of a problem to really understand it. Okay, so let's say that an animal gets a disease. If you only study the disease, but you don't really know what makes health, then you can end up giving the animal a bunch of drugs and think, okay, the animal will be fine. But if you don't realize, for example, that hoof rot comes from too much moisture accumulating in fields, then you keep giving the animals antibiotics, which ultimately wipes their body out, kills the mitochondria, turns them into sick animals, but you haven't irrigated the fields to stop the hoof rot.
Right.
So what I learned is step number one is you've always got to study both sides of a problem. But most people in academia are highly polarized and they believe their way is the only way, and they don't even want to look at the other side of a problem because it's almost sacrilegious, kind of like a Christian won't study Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or Taoism because they kind of program you to think those are all the works of the devil. Well, when you start studying some of these other religions, you realize Christianity is really, and Judaism and Islam are really religions for children because they teach you that God is taking care of you. God's doing everything for you, and all you got to do is worship this invisible daddy in the sky. And paradoxically, you'll get your reward in the afterlife. But in the meantime, you get tortured and bled out instead of actually thinking, wait a minute, look, let's apply constructive thinking here. Right? It doesn't make sense. Why would you torture yourself to get favor from an invisible God that paradoxically is very different than the gods in other religions? So there's no unifying theme whatsoever there. So I gave you a farming example, I gave you a religion example, and an academic example. Well, there's a million of them. I mean, all you got to do is look at any field. For example, if you look at nutrition, well, hell, academic nutrition, all you got to do is go to a nutrition conference and it looks like an obesity conference and it's all nutritionists. The entire field of nutrition was actually started by General Mills in the late 30s and early 40s to train people to sell processed food, and they called them nutritionists. But it's actually purported to be a healthcare industry, but it's not. So what do you have? You got billions of people all over the world buying pills that are packaged that come from corporately farmed, commercially farmed soils, and there is no way to filter pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides out of those plants, and the chemicals in the soil wipe out the microorganism populations, which means you don't have any nutrient resources or energetic resources available to the plant because the plants themselves are malnourished and sick. So now we give this to people all over the world calling it nutrition, but really what they're eating is concentrated doses of low nutrient value plants that are highly sick and highly toxic. So the same way, for example, a killer whale eats several hundred pounds of salmon a day. So if the killer whale's eating salmon that are poisoned by mercury and it's eating several hundred pounds a day, eating killer whale would be very, very toxic, just like eating tuna is toxic because it eats piles of smaller fish, all of which have mercury poisoning.
Right.
So
how does the everyday person, you operate in a world of, I guess, professionals that, probably the elite, the few people, but the mass public have a very, I guess, diluted view, and there's, everything that you can read in one magazine or one podcast or blog post is totally contradicted by another one, and they seem both credible
that's
sources.
Perfect. My students come to that paradox all the time, and that's what led me to do all the research that I did, to develop the systems that I did.
Right.
Because the deeper you go into any field, the more you realize equally qualified experts sit on both sides of the debate table, and nobody can agree on almost any damn thing. And I tell my students that's exactly what you need. And they say, why? It's so confusing. I say, so you'll use your own damn brain and go research it and test it on yourself first. My philosophy is make yourself the guinea pig first. Everything I've taught anyone I've tested extensively on myself or in my clinical practice, and then refined it to where I was confident enough that I wasn't misleading people to teach it to them.
Right.
The fact that we have juxtaposition or checkmate in almost any field on any topic is an invitation to stop listening to other people who think they're experts, most of which don't even practice what they preach. I can show you loads of experts on biomechanics and weightlifting that can't lift weights. There's mountains of them out there. For example, experts on nutrition that don't understand. For example, you cannot be an expert on nutrition if you don't understand basic soil science, because basic soil science is what produces the damn nutrition in the plant in the first place. But I don't think I can count the nutritionists on one hand that I've met in my life traveling the world, lecturing to these people, that even had a clue how microorganisms works, how the soil is structured, how it captures cosmic radiation, how that energizes soil, what the difference is between paramagnetic and diamagnetic soil or stones, and how they work together to create a magnetic attraction, and the list just fucking goes on, right? So
So just coming back to that point then, like contradiction, you do it yourself, and you mentioned in terms of what you got taught on the farm, which is how to think, not what to think.
Right.
Is that a philosophy then that you carry through to your own teachings? Because that's I guess a big part of your business is
yes.
education.
Ultimately, what a Czech professional is someone who's taught a system of how to gather the essential data you need to make an intelligent decision about a physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual problem. Spiritual means encapsulated. It means your connection to the larger whole.